Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar Replacing Chernobyl. My name is Eglė Rindzevičiūtė. I am Associate Professor of Criminology and Sociology at Kingston University, London, and it is my honor and pleasure to chair this event today. We'll have a range of very interesting speakers, all of whom you can see on your screen now. First and foremost, I would like to invite Dr. Peter Zussi, who is Associate Professor of Czech and Comparative Literature, as well as the Director of Fringe Center for the Study of Social and Cultural Complexity at the UCL, to say a few words about his institution and this event.
Thank you, Eglė. My name is Peter Zussi, and I'm the Director of the Fringe Center, which was founded 5 years ago at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Institute of Advanced Studies at University College London. The Fringe Center investigates and publishes research on social and cultural phenomena that are ambiguous or even invisible to public perception, and that resist the usual vocabularies of academic discourse. And we invite any interested parties or viewers out there listening to us now to contact us for more information and to sign up for our newsletter. When Eglė first approached us with the idea for this event, we immediately jumped at the prospect. And so I just wanted to say a few words why I think this is such a special and exciting event. The Chernobyl disaster is one of the most significant and dramatic events of at least the last century. Yet for those of us who are not physicists or nuclear engineers, it presents unique challenges to our ability to visualize and understand. The fact of the explosion is terrifyingly clear, but the explanation for the explosion is tremendously complex, irreducible to neat images and tidy narratives, and instead inseparable from esoteric topics like RBMK reactor design, xenon 135, and positive void coefficients. The consequences of the catastrophe, of course, are on a scale that defies the imagination. So the story of this disaster involves multiple layers of invisibility. The invisibility of what's going on in the reactor's core just prior to the explosion, the invisibility of the radiation afterwards, the invisibility of facts that were covered up by nervous authorities, the invisibility of so many individuals who risked and in many cases lost their lives to contain the destruction, and the invisibility of the uncounted civilian casualties. This invisibility stands in terrifying contrast to the human costs of the disaster. The 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl is so remarkable because it does such an extraordinary job in making the disaster at least partly visible, though not fully comprehensible. Making invisible things visible involves all sorts of challenges and risks, but I believe we have an ideal panel today to discuss the different aspects involved, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
I am Alina Ledenova, Professor of Politics and Society at UCL, Founding Director of Fringe. My area of expertise is informality, and I specialize on open secrets and unwritten rules and the workings of systems. So I am excited to be here. I will be moderating discussion today, but I am also looking forward to many more discussions to come. I invite everyone to become a Fringer and sign up for the Fringe newsletter with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Alona. I would like to invite the Lithuanian cultural attaché in the UK to say a few words as well before we start. Juste, please.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank you everyone who agreed to participate and also people watching us now, and to thank our numerous partners, organizations such as Kingston University, UCL Fringe, UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, also Arts and Humanities Research Council. A very important partner that I work with always is Lithuanian Culture Institute and Lithuanian Embassy in London, and a very important partner connected to, of course, the topic of today is Go Vilnius, the tourism agency of the city of Vilnius. While Lithuania has a lot of very interesting moving image artists and filmmakers and directors, it also became recently a very interesting set for many well-known, worldwide known films, starting from Hannibal Rising to hosting film productions such as Stranger Things, War and Peace, Catherine the Great, and of course Chernobyl. What is interesting is perhaps that these film productions were attracted and cities. It's not just authentic and layered architecture and untouched nature, but perhaps also highly professional and qualified film production teams in Lithuania. And also I have noticed that a lot of contemporary artists or other creatives work in this field. Almost every contemporary artist I know have at some point contributed to these productions, which I think is an interesting point to discover as well. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that the complexity of this, again, authentic architecture and different kinds of architecture that Lithuania provides for these film sets. It's one thing when we are very happy that these films are seen worldwide, and another is the actual reception or emotional attachment by us ourselves who live in Lithuania to certain kind of architecture that is also part of it is shown in Chernobyl. Thank you, and very curious to hear the presentations.
Thank you very much, Houston. I'm just trying how to spotlight myself. Okay, so hello everyone again, and I don't really want to take too much of your precious time, but I wanted to share with you just a few insights and just a few main points on the Chernobyl disaster and its mediation, so that it could serve as the basis for our ongoing discussion. Just let me share my slides. Okay. Right. So why did we decide to organize this roundtable, and why is it called Replacing Chernobyl? What does it mean to replace Chernobyl? So as many of you know very well, 34 years ago, on the 26th of April, 1986, the number 4 reactor in Chernobyl suffered a terrible accident, during which the reactor's core exploded. This resulted in a radioactive fallout all across Europe, massive population displacement, casualties, and contamination. Large areas in Ukraine and Belarus were polluted. Chernobyl, as Peter said, is considered widely the worst nuclear disaster that ever happened. What is important is that the Chernobyl disaster also undermined what was a very shaky public trust in the Soviet government, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself and the end of the Cold War. It also shattered the belief in the bright nuclear future, both in the East and West. So why and how do we remember Chernobyl? What lessons can be learned from this disaster? Today, in the context of a global pandemic, the questions of the public trust in governments and the limits of scientific expertise are really burning and important, and many people are asking this question. As others said already, Chernobyl is really a lesson in complexity. And this was brilliantly showed in the miniseries Chernobyl, released almost exactly 1 year ago. Directed by Johan Renck, who is with us today, the series transported the viewer to the Soviet reality of the 1980s. This time machine for this journey was mainly set in Lithuania, a small nuclear country that hosts a Chernobyl-type nuclear power plant, Ignalina, And in these images, you see the Ignalina nuclear power plant on the top and the Chernobyl at the bottom. So Ignalina performed Chernobyl. And Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, performed Pripyat. And I was telling Johan the other day, now when I'm flying back, I'm based in London, when I'm going back to Lithuania and when my plane is landing in Vilnius, I'm saying to myself, welcome to Pripyat, I just can't help it. So these localities, these locations, they create the impression of authenticity to the great satisfaction of global audiences, as evidenced by the viewing figures of the miniseries. But they did more than just entertain. They brought the complex questions of trust, power, authenticity and cultural mediation, and ethics of scientific expertise back to everyday discussions. But what happens when we replace the Chernobyl experience to different locations and different cultural media? What social, cultural, and ethical consequences does this act of replacement involve? And today we gathered prominent speakers to discuss these questions. And without further ado, I would like first to give the floor to the speakers. And before they speak, I would like to ask everyone to introduce themselves, as well as to observe to the 5-minute limit. So we'll have a series of very, very short, concentrated individual statements to allow for plenty of time for discussion. And our first speaker is Simon Evans.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Kingston University and UCL Fringe and all the associated partners for hosting this event. I have to say this is not my natural habitat. I'm a projects and programs sort of guy, having overseen the Chernobyl Shelter Fund for the last 10 years. And so but I do welcome the opportunity to be a little bit more reflective about Chernobyl. I suspect many of you are wondering, why is the European Bank for Reconstruction Development involved in Chernobyl? We are an international financial institution, and in the late 1990s, the management of the bank bravely accepted to put together an international multi-donor fund to put Chernobyl onto a safe and secure footing. I say they bravely accepted. I think at the time they probably didn't realize quite how brave they were being. But as we've reached the end of the fund now, I think we can reflect with great pride upon what has taken place. So what I would like to do today is really talk a little bit about where we are at present in Chernobyl, to put it into context, to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we faced, to reflect a little bit on some of my personal views about the mini-series, and also talk a little bit about thoughts about the future and the achievements and the role of the international community on these sort of events. So firstly, Chernobyl really is a land of extremes, and it remains a land of extremes today. It was the worst ever nuclear accident. It's the most contaminated place on the face of the earth, but it's also the site of the largest ever collaboration on nuclear safety in history, with over 45 donor nations coming together under the auspices of the bank that I work for, contributing 2.1 billion euros to mitigate the impacts of the accident. And these are donor nations as diverse as Saudi Arabia, USA, Germany, France, the UK, even small nations like Estonia, Lithuania, Iceland, Liechtenstein have all participated, which I think is a great example of the international community coming together. What they did is, over many, many years, put in a program of action under our management to make Chernobyl safe and secure for the long future. And the peak of this was the construction of the new safe confinement. And I will share my screen to highlight the new safe confinement and what we have done with the, to try to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is the facility in about 2010. This is the destroyed reactor unit 4 and the so-called object shelter, which was hastily put up in heroic circumstances after the accident, and indeed is reflected, the construction of it is reflected in the mini-series. Here you have the site of the preparation of the new safe confinement. And here you can see the new safe confinement as was slid in 2016 and completed and handed over to the Ukrainian authorities in 2019. It is a remarkable piece of infrastructure, and it's designed to do two essential things. One is to confine the old reactor to minimize the further radiation releases from the reactor. And indeed, since the sliding reactor, we've seen radiation rates fall by around 10 times from the old reactor. And remember, people don't often think about this. At the time of the accident, it's estimated that around 96% of the radiological inventory of Unit 4 still sits inside the ruined remains of Unit 4. Only 4% of it emerged into the atmosphere. But also importantly, this facility gives you the capacity over many decades to come to start taking apart the lethal inventory of Unit 4 in a safe and secure environment. And in many respects, that's the most important aspect of this, because it can enable them to look to the future with security and confidence that they've got the facilities to deal with the consequences of the accident. I should also want to say a few words about the mini-series. I thought the mini-series was first class. It was excellent. It provided an excellent, accurate explanation in understandable ways of the technological aspects of the disaster. It also highlighted correctly the somewhat dystopian environment at the time, the bureaucracy, the secrecy, the lack of coordination. But there was one aspect which I really appreciated, which I feel is underestimated in many of the popular literature about Chernobyl, which I felt the miniseries brought out, and that was the heroism of the individuals concerned, their selflessness in dealing with the consequences, and not just the liquidators, but when management recognized the magnitude of the catastrophe they're dealing with, their ability to put that into place. And I think the miniseries really brought that out in a magnificent way that has perhaps been underrepresented in the past. So I've only got 4.5 minutes. I could talk for a lot longer. Just a few little thoughts about the longer term at Chernobyl. I think many people think of Chernobyl as a place of haunting place, a place of disaster, catastrophe. And obviously I understand that, and that's not going to go away. But I also think of Chernobyl, when I've been there for the last decade or so, as a place of achievement, a place of where the international community can take great pride in what they have done in terms of putting together an immense program of assistance to share with shared goals and long-term determination over many, many years to put Chernobyl onto a safe and secure footing from many, many different countries involved. And I hope that as our policymakers today wrestle with an immense crisis globally, that they're able to reflect a little bit on what the international community has achieved at Chernobyl, recognizing that the international community, when they come together with shared goals and shared objectives, can achieve so much more than acting individually. So I hope that's maybe a lesson that some people will be able just to reflect on a little bit as we go further forward. I will stop there. I've probably overdone my 4.5 minutes, but I hope I've managed to give a little bit of a picture of what is Chernobyl at the moment and what the future could be. And I will look forward to hearing the presentations from our other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you.
You muted yourself, Egla. You've muted yourself.
Sorry. So we will continue looking into the present legacies of Chernobyl, and I would like to invite Simon Watson to give the next presentation. Simon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Hegel, for inviting me to this. My name is Simon Watson. I'm a senior lecturer in robotic systems at the University of Manchester. My research interests are in developing robots to work in extreme and hazardous environments. Most of the robots that we develop are actually for the use in decommissioning nuclear facilities, such as those at Sellafield and Dounreay in the UK, but we also do work at Fukushima out in Japan. The technology we develop is also applicable to places like Chernobyl. So nuclear disaster zones quite often become graveyards for robots, and Chernobyl was no different. There were over 60 remote controlled robots that were developed for use at Chernobyl. However, all of them failed. Many were designed to help remove the highly radioactive material which was ejected from the reactor, such as the STR-1 and the Joker, which are shown here. But unfortunately, their failure meant that the debris had to be removed by humans, known as liquidators. The use of these liquidators ultimately led to the debris being cleared, but at a significant cost, with many fatalities and severe sicknesses. So why did the robots fail? Well, there were a number of reasons. The first is that, like humans, robots are affected by radiation. They may be able to last longer, but ultimately the radiation will cause the electronics to stop working. Unlike humans, however, robots don't get radiation sickness and die at some point later. Most of the time, they'll just stop working and be stranded where they are. This poses several issues. For example, what happens if the robot stops in the middle of an access point and you can't get around it? Do you have to risk sending a person in to pull the robot out? Or if it fails, are you actually making things worse by increasing the amount of debris that needs to be removed? The second reason is that robots work really well in structured, obstacle-free environments doing repetitive tasks. Think how robots have revolutionized manufacturing and production. Disaster areas like that at Chernobyl are the antithesis of this. They're highly unstructured, they're unknown environments with unique and challenging tasks that need to be undertaken. Finally, robots quite often require human remote operation. The ones that were used in Chernobyl had to be teleoperated by people at a very safe distance. Now, if you've ever tried to use those arcade grabbing games where you've got the claw to pick up the little teddy bears, you know how hard trying to coordinate this type of activity is. Now imagine doing that at 100 meters away, looking through a very small CCTV camera with really grainy footage. And you can try to get a feel and an understanding of how challenging it is. And then you don't know if the robot's going to fail or not, or if you've done something wrong. So it really doesn't lend itself immediately to the use of robots. Fast forward 25 years, and unfortunately very little had changed. Nuclear accidents are very rare. This is something to be thankful of. But when the Fukushima accident occurred, robots weren't ready. There is very little demand for these type of activities or these type of robots. Mobile robots aren't widely used in other industries, so there aren't many alternatives. Those robots that had been developed in the late 90s and early 2000s hadn't been properly maintained and they couldn't be used. And as with Chernobyl, the robots from other application areas were repurposed, but the same challenges still remained. Operations in high radiation areas, which are highly unstructured with challenging activities. Many of the initial robots were unsuccessful, succumbing to the radiation as they did in Chernobyl. However, it wasn't long before robots were able to access some of the less radioactive areas and help with the debris clearance and exploration activities. There's now a multitude of robotic platforms in development and in use to aid the cleanup operation. Thankfully, the Fukushima incident was very different to Chernobyl. Whilst there were explosions in the aftermath, they didn't expel the highly radioactive material like at Chernobyl. The inability to make use of robots didn't lead to the deaths and serious illnesses that they had in Chernobyl. So where are we going in the future? Well, technology has developed significantly over the last 30 years, but in robotics, even more so over the last 5 years. Whilst industrial robotics have revolutionized manufacturing and industry, mobile robots haven't yet made that same impact. But hazardous environments, including nuclear, offshore energy, mining, and space, all require robots to be exploited to their full potential. And there's significant research globally and in the UK in designing robots to operate in them. Here's just a few of the robots that have been developed in the UK and for use at Fukushima and in Finland. Nuclear disasters are rare occurrences and robots weren't able to play as big a part in the cleanup and recovery as many would have hoped. We can never be truly ready for another nuclear disaster, but if another one occurs, robotics stands ready to help out. Linking back to what Simon Evans said about seeing Chernobyl in a different light, one thing to consider is looking at Chernobyl as an asset. So in the UK, we have the Sellafield nuclear facility or nuclear site, which stores a lot of our waste. And it has a negative press, or has had a negative press. But if we flip that and change it into an asset, it becomes somewhere where we can trial and test new technologies. We can make the most of it. If we can solve those problems, we can apply that same technology to a whole range of problems around the world. I think I've said enough for now, so I will pass back. Thank you very much. Pass back to Egil.
Thank you very much, Simon. Our next speaker is Professor Paul Josephson. Paul, are you with us? Yes, you are. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Have I not unmuted myself?
Yes, you have.
Okay, thank you. I'm Paul Josephson, professor of Russian and Soviet history at Colby College in Maine, and also affiliated with Tomsk State University in Siberia, and a historian of science and technology who teaches every other year a course on nuclear environmental history. I'd like to share my screen. A few other things about introduction here, if I may. I wrote my first refereed article on Chernobyl in 1986. I was writing my dissertation when newspapers and television programs called me and asked what had happened in Chernobyl. Hadn't 2,000 people died? And this was a kind of sensationalism that is not present in the HBO series Chernobyl, which I thought was delightful and fascinating, very important to all of us. My first visit to Chernobyl was in 1991. And it occurred to me as a historian of science and technology that I just wanted to talk about the way in which cinema, literature, and art can be used better to understand the nature of modern science and technology. You can use character development, in the case of film, sets, costuming, and so on, to explore more fully the interactions of facts with emotion, politics, terror. And this enables exploration of the human dimensions of technogenic catastrophes that are often not present in our scientific writing and even in our historical writings. I think the praise for Chernobyl is largely deserved. It's vivid, realistic, within the limits of artistic license. As our speakers have said, it puts faces on thousands of victims. It makes radiation illness real and all the more frightening. And for me, it's importantly put nuclear power and nuclear safety in the forefront of attention again. I would like to mention, as some people are loath to do, that it opens again the old sore of technological failure. That is the design of the RBMK reactor, which has no containment. So that if there is an accident of the sort that occurs, which we are told will never happen again, there are 10 of these reactors still operating in the world, or 11, then products of fission may escape the reactor itself. Was this a typical Soviet accident with typical uncaring party officials? I think certainly at first that's the case. Get back to work and stop complaining, show your heroism, and people did. They did so not because they were told, but because they needed to. And I thought it was really, to this day, shocking, if I was in Chernobyl in 1991, that one of the goals of the liquidators' tasks was to get the other reactor units working again as quickly as possible. So imagine being at a power station after that accident with all that radioactivity, and yet the goal is to produce power again. And they were totally unprepared for the accident. I think throughout the world that may be the case. I know that France provides iodine tablets for people within a 20-kilometer radius, but I'm not sure that anywhere else in the world does that systematically in case there is an accident. The series reminds us of some shocking things, that at first the plant director couldn't believe there'd been an explosion and communicated that to Moscow. That a May Day celebration was held a week later with children exposed. I thought the main actors were really phenomenal in this film. Accurate portrayals, although, as people have noted, Ulana Khamyuk is kind of a composite character, but nevertheless important to communicate information we need to know. One of the heroes, sad hero, is Valery Legasov. And we learned a lot about the weaknesses of the reactor program designed in the institute where he worked by the president of the Academy of Sciences and his colleagues, the RBMK. And Alexandrov, whom I met, I think in '89, never admitted a design flaw. We meet Dyatlov, who was deputy chief engineer, who was running the controls that night and encouraged his workers to push the experiment forward. He did, until his death, criticize the RBMK. I think I would have liked to see more in the film about perestroika and glasnost. I think something is missing there just a bit about the importance for the future of perestroika and glasnost of this accident, as Gorbachev himself later said. Now, to return to the arts and disaster, for me, one of the most remarkable pieces of work about the Chernobyl disaster is The Truth About Chernobyl by Grigory Medvedev, which was written in '87 and published only in 1989. And it has no footnotes. There may be some exaggerations, and yet it was one of these things from which I learned a great deal about the disaster. And we can learn also from this kind of literature elsewhere. Recall that Hiroshima, Hersey's fantastic work, was published in the New Yorker, as was Silent Spring at first, or Robert Junk's exaggerated Brighter Than a Thousand Suns. Now, I'd like to close by saying, and as you can see, I've run through some slides there rather quickly because, like everyone else, I'm over time already. I think it's a sign of the health and the quality of the HBO series that Russian officials and people in Rosatom are trying to denigrate it and have raised again the story that a CIA agent was around Chernobyl at the time of the accident. So this to me is a sign that art, film, literature can trigger our thinking in ways that scientific articles often leave us flat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker is Tatiana Kaspersky. By the way, Paul was joining us from Barcelona, and so does Tatiana. Tanya, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, have I successfully unmuted myself?
Yes, you have.
Oh, great. So I'm Tatiana Kaspersky, and I work as a research fellow at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, in Spain. I'm a political scientist and this historian, and I work on political and social aspects of nuclear technology in former Soviet countries, including on memory politics of the Chernobyl disaster. And I will try to share my screen. Okay. So after a disaster, scientists, engineers, political leaders, and citizens worry whether its lessons will be learned to avoid a repeat in the future. And for this to happen, the disaster and its impacts must remain publicly visible and remembered. However, radiation is invisible, as is the hurt and suffering it causes. The natural and social sciences provide the instruments to make a radioactive disaster visible, but art and literature can be much more powerful tools to tell the story of a catastrophe. And the Chernobyl miniseries indeed shed a powerful light that brought the disaster to public attention again. And in more than a decade during which I have explored the politics of the Chernobyl memory, I have never seen such intense debates about it as after the series came out. And I think it is extremely important. I was surprised by a very positive reception to the Chernobyl series in the former Soviet spaces. Judging from social platforms and newspapers, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian witnesses and survivors felt moved that their story has been accurately retold by someone outside of their world. Yet, we must remember that each angle of visibility has blind spots, and there are limitations about what a disaster movie can tell us. And HBO's Chernobyl appears as an event somewhat limited in space and in the time, and it must be replaced in a much broader historical and geographical context. First, the disaster as portrayed in the film is almost entirely and only a Soviet disaster. The series deserves praise for how magnificently well the producers recreated the spirit of the Soviet era and Soviet material culture. But it also at the same time somewhat reinforces this familiar narrative of Chernobyl as a typically Soviet accident involving a typically Soviet reactor caused by typically Soviet secrecy. But we know that many of the factors that led to Chernobyl are potentially present anywhere a large-scale risky technology like a nuclear power station is operating. Take, for example, secrecy. Of course, the KGB secrecy is different from corporate secrecy, but at the end of the day, trade secrets and secret police secrets are equally detrimental to the learning and sharing of knowledge so crucial to safety. Second, the Chernobyl disaster has had global geopolitical and health and safety impacts, but it also should be a reminder of many other often forgotten sites of radioactive accidents and routine pollution, from uranium mines in Africa to nuclear bomb test sites in the Marshall Islands. Third, the HBO Chernobyl disaster is also somewhat limited in time. It begins shortly before the explosion. It ends less than 2 years later with the trial of plant operators. But the disaster has continued for decades on territories that are still contaminated and in human bodies exposed to radioactivity. As the film closes, you read on the screen that the film is dedicated to those who suffered and sacrificed. Many people are still suffering and being sacrificed today. For example, the so-called liquidators who have gradually lost state support, and many of them are struggling with illnesses or dying today. Also, hundreds of thousands of people still live in contaminated territories, while Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine have decided to return to lands to some of these lands to so-called normalcy, explaining to residents that it is safe to live there as long as they take individual measures to protect themselves from exposure. Yet these daily routines of self-protection from invisible radiation are far from normal. And we need only think how far from normal it is to adjust to the coronavirus pandemic. The Chernobyl HBO series, so while watching this series, I think we should remember that the disaster will continue in vast spaces for an undetermined time, and Chernobyl is but one of many sources of radioactive pollution in the world.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So now that we are talking about memory and the cultural images of Chernobyl and the ways in which perception is traveling, we are really moving into the domain of cultures. So many people identify nuclear technology and science with something that is really quite specific. It lives in the laboratories. But it actually is something that lives in books and films, and that's how it enters public imagination. So our next speaker is Michael Goddard. And Michael, the floor is yours. If you could unmute yourself, yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Egli. As you can see, I'm coming live from the abandoned restaurant in Chernobyl, which is doubly resonant given the impossibility to actually go to a restaurant at the moment too. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so and yeah, and I'm a reader in film, television, and moving image at University of Westminster, so it's very much the direction with which I approach this. So starting my stopwatch. So yeah, that's my title, you can see there. So as well known, many critical responses to Chernobyl focus on questions of truth and accuracy, whether in terms of scientific aspects of nuclear energy and radiation, or the historical depiction of late USSR state socialism, and the way two are combined and the ecological effects of and Soviet response to the catastrophe. My panelists, who you've heard from already, are much more qualified than I am to discuss some of these aspects. This focus on accuracy is in a sense unfortunate but inevitable, since the show itself is framed from the opening sequence via a simplistic notion of truth. And please ignore the quality of these screenshots, because I did actually have to take photos off the TV because my screen grabbing thing was not working on my laptop very well. So yeah, by a simplistic notion of a truth as opposed to stories which identify villains and heroes, which is in fact precisely what the miniseries itself does, with a more complex and to an extent unknowable and unrepresentable historical chain of events. It's unfortunate, however, since the show is powerful and successful for reasons entirely other to historical truth that are more connected to the very aesthetic choices highlighted by some of the show's detractors and minimized by some of the show's creators. Following Stephen Prince's 1996 work called True Lies, and he's done several different kind of works along these lines, this is much more a type of aesthetic truth or perceptual realism, or true lies as he calls it, than conventional notions of indexical representation of a prior reality. While Prince was writing mostly about high-end Hollywood digital special effects films, but also faux history films like Forrest Gump, at times representing unverifiable realities such as the behavior of dinosaurs or aliens, these films are taken as true by audiences because of their powers to engender verisimilitude or believability, based on and contributing to already understood cinematic codes of mise-en-scène, action, and performance, rather than on any prior existing reality to be represented. In other words, the power to create a kind of aesthetic truth through believable fabulation, what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze called the powers of false. So one might think that this is hardly applicable to Chernobyl, since it's based on an actual historical event, and late Soviet society and politics is hardly an unknowable myth akin to the dinosaurs. And yet some of the best accounts of the show emphasize precisely these aspects of fabulation. For example, in a dossier of reviews on the show in the American Historical Review, Alex Wallerstein, pointing to the show's many inaccuracies, argues it needs to be evaluated in terms of whether, quote, a small lie can tell a bigger truth, and despite misgivings, cautiously affirms this. Yulia Komska goes deeper than this, zeroing in on the opening scenes with its black screen and highly overdetermined declarations of authenticity, which I showed a few examples of before, which give rise to unresolvable aesthetic paradoxes, given the multiple liberties taken with the historical accounts the series draws on. More importantly, she identifies the show's success as follows. Ironically, the precipitous Chernobylization of public consciousness in the US and beyond since the series release on May 6, 2019, has largely been a function of its artifice. For Komska, the show works so well as a believable audiovisual narrative precisely through its intertextual aesthetic flourishes that resonate with documentaries, disaster genre films, and art cinema, such as the angelic aerial perception of space and architecture of Wender's Wings of Desire. And you can sort of see contrasting clips there from Chernobyl and Wings of Desire. I would argue that this constitutes a Cold War aesthetic, at once evoking Western Cold War series like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, especially in the opening scenes of a dissident scientist desperately recording memoirs onto a cassette recorder, to the block aesthetic seen in many later state socialist films and TV works, and perhaps most memorably in Kieślowski's Decalogue. The intensively filmed brutalist architecture of both apartment blocks and the nuclear power plant, made possible by similar architecture still existing in Lithuania, the lovingly recreated Soviet kitchen interiors, from carpeting to wallpaper, to the images of nature, animals, and industry before and after disaster that evokes filmmakers like Tarkovsky, and especially the journey into the underground water tanks. It feels very much like a nuclearized version of Andrzej Wajda's canal, and you can sort of see sort of some image contrast there as well. All serve to create a believable late Soviet world, regardless of the liberties taken with the historical record and the avowed anti-Soviet intentions of its creators. The fact that the show has given a boost to Chernobyl dark tourism, not only in Chernobyl itself, see, for example, the Tarkovsky entitled documentary Stalking Chernobyl, but also in Lithuania, where it was filmed, is further testament to the series' powers of the false and capacity to engender a new fabulation of the past, or perhaps, you know, sort of a memory of an alternate future as well. Given the resonances and contemporary ascendancy of fake news, the latest form of true lies, propaganda, or fabulation, it's perhaps more to questions of the aesthetic powers and responsibilities of the false, of fabulation and aesthetic invention that we should turn to understand the impact of the series, rather than any good or bad relationship with simplistic notions of the truth. So that's my little provocation, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Michael, and really exciting parallels, especially with Decalogue and Wajda's the tunnel. So our next speaker is Vitaly Strigunkov, and Vitaly is a visual artist based in Lithuania who worked on the production team. And Vitaly, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Agnes, for inviting me. As a visual artist, I would like to focus on the visual fabric of the series and replacement of actual Chernobyl nuclear power plant, where the locations found in Lithuania where series were shot. Also, I would like to stress the paradox of well-commended visual authenticity, especially regarding the invisibility of radiation. According to production designer of the series, Luke Ho, for around 160 sets that comprise the production, approximately 40% of sets were created on stage, while majority of the rest locations were based in multiple lookalike places all across Lithuania. These were locations that almost never been filmed in the way they were looking originally, and there were smaller or bigger changes implemented into them directly or with the help of visual effects during post-production. Of course, many of these sets were replacing sites of lesser importance for the visual accuracy, and there were places like apartment interiors, hospitals, hotel lobbies, offices, or small villages around Pripyat. But unavoidably, production team of the show had to find locations that would replace Pripyat and Chernobyl power plant itself. And I would like to share some slides. And so, Fabioniškės, a Vilnius district built in the late 1980s, became a site for memorable scene of the Pripyat evacuation. Symmetrical and brutal structure of the district, as well as its green-gray mood for production, seemed to be perfect Pripyat look-alike area, regardless of visible plastic windows and balconies that noticeably have changed its look since district was built. However, the most important and yet the most difficult part of visual replacement was the Chernobyl power plant. Unlike in most cases of other locations, there were not many or even a few possibilities to choose from to substitute real Chernobyl. Hence, we can almost be sure that the fact of presence of the nuclear power plant in the process of decommissioning in Ignalina, Lithuania, and access to it was the main reason that brought production of the series there. And the advantage of the possibility to shoot the series in the nuclear power plant perhaps was a visual sense of its scale of exterior and some elements of interior that later, like a puzzle, were combined with sets built on stage and visual effects. Brought together, these replaced elements made a visual fabric of cinematic reconstruction of the place and the event. But the nature of such cinematic image is completely different from documentary footage that is broken into multiple cracked bits and parts, only bearing traces of time code. And cinematic image has no imprint or signs of radiation that were present on the very first photographs of Chernobyl, taken from helicopter by photographer Igor Kostin within first few hours after explosion. Those first photographs of the site of accident appeared to be mostly black, as if burned by light, opaque and grainy, and on the contrary to that cinematic image, omitted the visual interruptions, visible traces of radiation, and replaced them with a high-quality image. So if this was the subject of discussion, certainly we could pose a question about the visual authenticity of so-called horrifyingly detailed show. But Chernobyl is not solely a reconstruction or recreation of documentary footage. It is a complete narrative story that makes us aware of what has happened from scientific, governmental, and personal points of view. It sets the place of nuclear accident not only in the reactor core and not even in the Soviet Union, but more importantly in our consciousness. And in my opinion, this is the greatest achievement of creators of this series that makes us keep it in our minds and juxtapose it with the times of global pandemics.
Thank you so much, Vitaly, and really very evocative pictures. Now it is time to give floor to the director of Chernobyl, Johan Rank. Johan, you are with us.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I am, as opposed to many of these other panelists, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scholar. I am just a filmmaker. And my, attraction to this script written by Craig Mason, the brilliant Craig Mason, was, primarily founded in my interest in psychology and emotions and human behavior, and sort of the translation of psychology into human behavior, much rather than my interest in, the scientific machinations behind this accident. So there's, as in making a film, of course, in any capacity, there's a lot of choices that have to be made, but ultimately it's an interpretation of something, and the balance in all these cases, when it comes to some extent depicting real events, is always a balancing act, because you have on one hand the scientific truth, and then on the polar side of it, you have something more akin to a personal tastes and preferences, and even sensibilities and instincts and all that kind of thing. So there will never be any depiction of an event, I think, that will be 100% truth to any viewer. There's an impressionistic aspect of any of these kind of things, and that is just the way it is, So, I mean, there was always a knowledge in when we were making this that in order to take an event that took place during some critical years and to try to abbreviate that into 5 hours, there will be shortcuts and there will be simplifications, and there will definitely be, from an individual point of view, things that have been left out to somebody's disappointment or something in that sense. I mean, that's just an obvious fact of how these things work. Nevertheless, I spent 2 years on this and digging deep wherever I could, whether it's in terms of trying to depict it as authentical as we possibly could, but also within the means of what we had to our disposal, of course. apart from this beautiful script, I think that Svetlana Alexeyevich book, Voices of Chernobyl, was something that interested me more than anything else, because it had to do with human behavior and human reactions to the events and to being there. And that again is what interests me more than anything else of this particular theme. But again, there is always authenticity is something to strive for, but authenticity always assumes a new shape within the filters of filmmaking, because there is another aspect of filmmaking that has to do with an individual or sensibility-driven taste levels that has to do with depicting something from a photographic level. And I'm as a filmmaker myself, I'm particularly interested in the photographic aspect and how that will guide our emotions in watching something. So, again, there is on one hand, you can try to depict something with perfect authenticity and touching upon something that becomes a documentary. But on the other hand, it's about what tickles me and what I'm interested in terms from a visual value and so on and so forth. So that's always going to be the case of any kind of artistic interpretation of an event, but nevertheless, our effort, and we went very deep and far and tried to find some authenticity in the depiction of this, and as well as, again, abbreviating years and years of an event into 5 hours to do it as close as we possibly could. And personally, that was a beautiful journey. We met a lot of people in the former Soviet Union, whether it was in Lithuania or Ukraine or in Russia. I met with liquidators. I talked to people, in order to try to understand and try to find a decent way to represent what these people had felt and what they have been exposed to, as much as ever possible. And it was a beautiful journey. I'm eternally grateful to have been part of this and to have had this close encounter with this event and with these people who were sort of affected by it and still are affected by it. But ultimately, for me, it's about what you feel rather than what you think. So my choices as a director is always going to be driven about how I feel about something than sort of the pragmatic, quote unquote, truths that are more pertaining to how you think about it. So that's how these things come about, and that's whether it's writing a book or writing a song or writing a poet or making a film. You will always feel the personality of the creators in the outcome of it, and hence it will never be a perfect mirror to the idea of the truth. So that's what it is. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johan, and thank you for speaking about emotions. As psychologists are telling us that our decisions are ultimately, even if we think that we are rational, we are guided by emotions. So if people feel strongly about things nuclear, maybe it will help them prioritize certain technical and scientific and public health decisions and hopefully a better way. And this is where art and film becomes so incredibly important. So I would like to thank all speakers for giving such interesting presentations, and I would like to invite us to move to the discussion part. I see that there are a lot of questions popping up in Q&A. Alona, do you have a pre-selection of a few questions that you could start with?
Thank you, Agle. What I've done so far, I've been looking at Q&A questions as they arrived. We already currently have about 16. I have channeled the questions to whom they were addressed in private chat to the speakers. So what I suggest that we quickly assemble those, but it would be great if the speakers could also have a look at the Q&A list of questions. And maybe if you want to come in to add to the original addressee, show us the hand, and we will take your comment on 2 fingers, as it were. Please try to be compact in your answers. So far, the leader of questions received is Johan. So I suggest maybe we will start in a reverse order of speakers, starting with more artistics. And here, Johan, I have sent you at least 3 questions already on why did you decide to omit military engineers? How did you decide what to select and to leave out? And how generally it's possible to balance fact and fiction? So the exact formulations of the questions and Q&A, and maybe we will give the floor to Johan first. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said in the beginning of my little speech there will always be a curation of material in terms of the story we're telling, and then ultimately it becomes servicing this specific theme that we are trying to tell. There is, obviously, and sadly, a lot of things that have been omitted, whether it's the military engineers or other things that of course deserve to be a part of this story as well. But Craig, who wrote the script, was very, he found his way in creating this puzzle, which I think is beautiful and works really well. And there is, obviously something that we chatted a lot about is there's even things that we filmed that ended up on the cutting room floor because they didn't fit within the time we had, these 5 hours that we had, or they, started to send us off on trajectories that were not sort of of fullest necessity of the story that we were telling. So yes, I agree that there is a version of this show that would have been 10 hours long, in which we would have had a much more sort of comprehensive range of really trying to contain all the events and everybody involved. But that's just the nature of the beast. You have a fixated amount of time, and then you have to make some choices. That's what happened there. What else? What was the other questions again? I don't really know how to maneuver this thing here. There was another. Well, I mean, if we speak about again the balance between truth and facts versus an artistic expression as a piece of film is supposed to be, I think in my view there are very many different types of media dedicated to to hold its own representation in terms of what we can do. I mean, for instance, a documentary, a pure documentary is perhaps a better tool in order to speak about absolute truths and try to not color them with anything else than the truth. So, and documentaries exist in this universe, and they exist about Chernobyl, and there is, that is one well to find your information from. Literature and scientific literature and sort of, documentation is another one. A film will always be an artistic representation of something, and the balance there again is up to the filmmakers, whether, where the truth is and where the facts are, and on the other hand, where psychology and dramatization and drama and character development and all of that. And these things do not go, perfectly hand in hand, and they never will. It's just the way it works. So, there's naturally people who feel that things are missing out from the series. There are naturally people who think that there are sort of misrepresentations and so on and so forth. But these are all sort of subjective thoughts, and there is just no way that you can create a piece of film in the world of drama that will satisfy everybody's need. That's just the way it is.
Thank you. Sandra Radenovich asks, Johan, where did the inspiration come from? And what do you feel most disappointed about?
My inspiration, I don't work with inspiration from other films. I never have, and I try not to. Of course, I've seen all the films, but the inspirations in terms of translating psychologies into behaviors and to visual representations come from my life and my 53 years of living on this earth, and the feelings and what attracts me and what doesn't attract me. I grew up in Sweden. I lived in Sweden during the 60s and the 70s and parts of the 80s. Sweden being to some extent in proximity with the former Soviet Union, which sort of, and Sweden in the 70s, which was a social democratic nation, had similarities with a lot of these Eastern European countries, and you know, there was an influence going on that sense, you know. But inspiration is a tricky word, you know. I am not in the business of I never went to film school, and I'm not in the business of using other films as my vessel of inspiration for what I make. I'm a bookworm, and all my inspiration comes from the films I created in my head as reading these books through my life, you know. What am I most disappointed in life, or with regards of the outcome of the series, or what?
In the series, with maybe some things you should have included or should have omitted, an afterthought, as it were.
Yeah. No, it's very hard to think like that. I think it's very difficult to look upon this piece after it's done. And again, 2 years of work is a long time, and you get deeply entrenched in it. It's very, you know, I don't have any disappointments or any joys. It is what it is. I have no perspective on it. I just make it, I'm in it, and I come out on the other side. I haven't rewatched the series, and I probably never will. It's just not how I work. It is what it is. I have no view on it more than that is what happened in the heat of the battle. This is what came out of it, and this is what it became. But you know, maybe one day I'll be mature and be able to have a view on it from a different perspective than my very sort of intrinsic personal one, you know. So yeah, it's a good question, but I don't have a good answer for it.
Thank you very much. Shall we just answer the questions that I have sent you in your chats? Tatiana, would you like to go ahead? A lot of questions in Q&A, you will notice, are about cultural context and experience, what it means to have survived as a child, for example, an accident, or be of generation that is known to have survived Chernobyl. Are there any insights you could suggest in response to Linda Richards and others?
So Linda Richards, she reminds us about the Navajo Nation's experience and the harm of uranium mines pollution. And I think she makes a great point that some harms, invisible harms, can actually reinforce each other, and some vulnerable populations have more chance to be in harm's way than the others. And of course, it is conceivable that radiation exposure makes immunity less strong, and that also makes these populations more vulnerable to today's COVID pandemic. As she asked about whether medical professionals are trained to try to understand that. I don't know about the training of medical professionals that much, but from what I observed in general about the education in schools and in the universities in Belarus about the radiation and its possible health impact, is that it's usually done in such a way that it's sort of disconnected from the problems that people face on the everyday basis in the contaminated territories. So I doubt that medical professionals are trained really to recognize these interactions between different factors. There is also another question by Anastasia that also asks about COVID pandemic. I wouldn't say that I really monitor Eastern European media about the effects of the pandemic, but I can say that it's maybe too early yet to say how much of this, how much of the fact that there is relatively less cases in Eastern European countries than in the West is related to the suppression of data, or how much of it is related to other factors. What we know for sure is there is, of course, suppression of information, and authorities do punish those who criticize them for the management of the pandemic. But there are also so many other factors like testing and the accuracy of testing and so on and so forth, and how early we're in the epidemic in these countries yet. So we'll have to wait to know for sure.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to come in on these questions and others addressed to you? There has been a question to every panelist, actually. If you know of any psychological or sociological studies on the impact of major disasters such as Chernobyl on minds and resilience of the generation that survives it.
Unmuting myself here. I'm unmuted. Greetings, colleagues. The psychological aspect of disasters is not something that I've studied, so I can't focus on that. I did see a few questions here, if you'd like me, that were directed towards me. Would you like me to wait on those until later or go ahead now?
I think you should go ahead with your question. I think Tatiana wants to come on this one.
Yeah, of course, there are actually a lot of studies on the psychological consequences of the disaster. But my frustration with these studies has been always that they somehow are, I think, instrumentalized in a way that they show that actually the evacuation measures and the relocation measures caused more harm than actual exposure to radioactivity. And for me, it's, and I think in a lot of the studies, there is not enough reflection about how psychology was instrumentalized, in my view, to make invisible other harms from the radiation exposure. But there are a lot of such studies.
Paul, over to you and your questions. I was thinking that maybe we will move from art and depiction and the fact versus fiction kind of discussion through complexity, and you will see very interesting comments in the Q&A about how the series has been very successful in depicting nuances of systema and very uneasy, non-straightforward conclusions, although it might have been lost on some of the audience. But those people who have experience of the communist regimes, they certainly appreciated that. And then we will move into the depiction of the technical, because some of the questions are really about robotics, and I have forwarded those to Simon. And then in the end, maybe we discuss the politicization, and there are a lot of questions for Simon Evans on that respect. So, and but more or less we go in the reverse order of speaking. So please jump in, Paul.
Thank you. I wanted to comment. Someone asked in the questions about how indeed have mainstream Russian media responded to the Chernobyl disaster film. And it seems that there's a real concern that the series may be damaging to Rosatom and its intention to continue to market new reactors abroad. Now, these are different kinds of reactor sales that Rosatom intends in this day and age, pressurized water reactors, not Chernobyl type. But there is this narrative in much of the Russian press, and I have a slide or two on that, if I may just quickly show you. Can I show? Egle, can I share my screen or no? No? Oh, there we go. I've got it. Share. Forgive me, everyone, for taking so long. So here we see people in the Russian press calling the film a caricature. Stanislav Natanzon, the anchor of Russia 24, says, the only things missing are bears and accordions. And there are a number of other comments that suggest that in face of this self-proclaimed ongoing nuclear renaissance in Russia, that there's fears this may lead to impingement or slowdown in sales of reactors abroad. I do want to recall that if you look at the first days of reporting, it's not only the Russian press that sometimes exaggerates or tells interesting stories based on what they've seen. I looked at the British press for the first 2 weeks after the accident, and atomic cloud horror, but basically all of these articles were about it can't happen here. That was the narrative of much of the Western media, whereas the Russian media today is saying it's just a caricature. This doesn't happen. And there's one other thing I wanted to point out. Egle asked me to share perhaps this aspect of it. There's another kind of Chernobyl response among the masses today, which is tawdry art, disaster tours, and what I call atomic porn. And this predates the film, but it's another way of it's a way of seeing Chernobyl, but it seems to me in a way it cheapens the memory of the liquidators and the families and the children, all the people who experienced Chernobyl firsthand, and the people who are suffering to this day without proper pensions. So the film doesn't fall into this pit of the weaker side of humanity.
Thank you, Paul. Is there anyone else who would like to come in on the questions of tourism? Vitaly, Simon.
Yeah, I'll say a word about tourism. I maybe leave the more philosophical contemplations about tourism to my fellow panelists who are slightly more qualified to talk about it than me. But on a very practical basis, I certainly welcome, broadly speaking, the fact that we see a greater awareness of Chernobyl now, a greater awareness of what happened, a greater level of interest in the site, what has been achieved to date, and also what are the challenges of the future, because Chernobyl still remains probably the world's most challenging nuclear decommissioning project. I have to say I go even grayer though when I see some of the slides that Paul has put up and some of the stuff you see on social media about nuclear tourism, because it seems to be quite poorly regulated. There is certainly, I think the radiation risks are not particularly high, but the normal industrial safety risks of wandering around crumbling buildings, collapsed buildings, staircases, no handrails, glass all over the place are dreadful, and nobody is really getting a grip on this. So I'm afraid I would be a little bit of a fan for a little bit more of a robust form of regulation when it comes to nuclear tourism, which can indeed, if it's got right, put the Chernobyl story into a proper historical perspective, and I think it would be good for everybody.
Simon, as you are here, there was a question actually addressed to you and also Simon Watson, who spoke first, but the question was about your references to Chernobyl as an asset or an achievement, which directly or indirectly is related to the issue of its popularity as a destination for tourism, for curiosity. It certainly has a sexiness for generations who are new. And so the question was not so much direct to Simon and Simon, but to the rest of the panelists. How do you feel about Chernobyl being branded as an asset or achievement? Is there anyone who would want to say something about that?
If no one else, could I elaborate a little bit further? I mean, Chernobyl will always be a disaster. It will always be a catastrophe, and it will always have that image that is correctly portrayed of bureaucratic incompetence, technical unawareness, cataclysmic failures of safety, and in many respects it's a memorial to the importance of doing things safely. What I do think, though, is on top of that, you can also view Chernobyl as an area of achievement in terms of what the international community have done coming together. It's also, and this is a point I didn't make, but I do feel it fairly strongly, it's unsettling to even think about the sort of the benefits of Chernobyl. But what happened on that fateful night transformed the nuclear industry for the better. It transformed the regulation, it transformed the safety. We have a huge amount of international transparency, safety, conventions, commitments that simply didn't exist. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it can't be done better. We've had some questions in the chat about Belarus. But if you take where we were in 1986 and what has been put in place by the international community on safety since then, Chernobyl transformed that narrative. And I think that's worth bearing in mind as well.
Thank you for this clarification. Michael, would you be prepared to talk about the link between tourism and ethics?
Well, I'm more particularly interested in the link between tourism and art or mediation. And one thing that's sort of interesting, I had one of the slides that I put up was for this quite recent documentary called Stalking Chernobyl, which is already a reference to Tarkovsky film Stalker, which has some kind of zone which has to be navigated with all kinds of risks and so forth. And it's not that this mediation or intertextuality just comes from the documentary. Actually, people who guide people around Chernobyl for years have actually referred to themselves as stalkers and so forth. So that's one interesting phenomenon. And I think the other thing that's interesting is also around this sort of idea of dark tourism and so forth, is where you get this kind of tourism actually happening somewhere else. So for example, now there's actually quite a boost to sort of Chernobyl tourism in Lithuania, which is kind of interesting, where people want to actually see the film sets and the other nuclear power station where a lot of this material was actually filmed, which you could sort of make a parallel to the way that in relation to, if you compare the extreme authenticity of things like Marcel Ophel's Shoah to things like Schindler's List, and now there's quite extensive Schindler's List tourism where tourists might come to Krakow and actually they'll be more interested to go and look at the film sets of where Schindler's List was filmed than to say go to Auschwitz-Birkenau or something like that. So in terms of the replacing idea, you also get this interesting kind of aesthetic displacement about where it comes to tourism as well, and sort of also, added to that sort of kind of certain effects of benefiting things like, say, the Lithuanian film industry and so forth, which is actually, I have an MA student who's researching exactly that. So I think that's a fairly interesting phenomenon or kind of effect of the series.
Thank you. Anyone else to add on artistic, aesthetics, tourism? If not, we will be moving to the questions that I have directed to you, and also asking you to address those questions you would like to take from the Q&A list.
No, I think Simon Watson and Egla had some things they wanted to say to that previous topic.
Okay. Great. Go ahead.
So thank you. Just very quickly. So there is really this phenomenon when people are going to filming locations rather than to the original locations. I find it my personal take that there is something really beautiful and powerful in that. It's also about engaging with this multi-layered level of our semiotic reality and understanding how our understanding is mediated through lots of diverse cultural medium, through lots of different locations. And there are obviously economic issues and benefits in relation to tourism. What I find it most difficult to kind of put my head around in the case of the Lithuanian tourism following the Chernobyl theme is the question of ethics. And it's not that this kind of practice should be regarded purely negatively, that Lithuania is now cashing in from what is Ukrainian and Belarusian disaster, but it's rather maybe to think, because there were also Lithuanian liquidators and Lithuanians also suffered from the fallout. But it's more to think how these sorts of practices could be organized in a more ethical way so that they pay back to the roots of that interest. I do not have solutions, but I think that's a pertinent question that should be asked.
Thank you, Simon, over to you, Simon Watson.
Thank you. So just on the nuclear tourism aspect and linking it back to the point I made about assets, facilities like Chernobyl, like Fukushima, disaster areas have an attraction to people. They want to go and see it. There's something kind of gruesome about going to see a disaster area, but those disaster areas are going to be there for a long time. People are going to want to go there. And so there's opportunities there to make the most of that. Linking it into, can it benefit the people who were most affected? But also, can you broaden the education? Can you use this as an opportunity to educate people about the disaster, about the underlying technology, about the underlying science? For decades, I think nuclear had a poor reputation. Nuclear was associated with bombs, with death, with destruction. And nuclear power, when it goes horribly wrong, when you have a nuclear power plant accident, it is big news. It's the equivalent, if you take the analogy of transport, you hear about plane crashes because they are very rare occurrences, and when they happen, large numbers of people die. But you don't hear about car crashes, and thousands of people die every year in car crashes, but we're all happy to just continue on with our lives. But when a plane crash happens, everyone stops and goes, right, should we be actually flying? Do we need to make major modifications? It's the same with nuclear power, because there's a lack of understanding, perhaps because they are so rare. When they happen, they're big news and people get afraid of them. But if you look at the number of people that have died due to the coal industry, due to oil, due to the other energy production systems, it's in the tens of thousands. The number of deaths directly associated with from a nuclear power plant accident is in the tens. The secondary deaths are higher than that, but the secondary deaths due to coal mining, due to oil production are far, far, far higher. And I think there's an opportunity, these type of series provide the opportunity to get an educational link into that and to have broader discussions about, yes, it is a serious incident, but put that in context with what you have to do with the rest of the world and how the rest of the world actually works. I can answer as well the robotics questions briefly on it. So I think there was a question on what's the hardest thing, what's the most challenging aspect of putting a robot in a nuclear environment. It's trying to go into an area where humans are. So humans are really complex beings. We've had thousands and thousands and millions of years of evolution or design, whichever way you want to view it. We are highly complex. And if you look at the state of the art of robots, they're 4 wheels. It's a glorified remote control truck. Humanoid robots, anthropomorphic robots, they're not there yet. And so what you're trying to do is essentially get a car to do what a human is doing and doing fine manipulation. And that's really hard. You're trying to go over obstacles where it can't get there. So your ability to go over obstacles, your ability to pick things up, to do tasks which are second nature to humans, that's the really hard part. You then have the radiation levels. And I think one of the other questions was, could you use carbon fiber? That doesn't act as a good radiation shield. Your best ones are things like lead and like tungsten, but you need inches of it. And if you need inches of that, it's the same shielding that you would have around the reactor. It just makes the robot too heavy, too cumbersome. And so where modern robots are heading is being sacrificial, actually. And you're going for lower cost robots, things that don't cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. You make robots that cost thousands. You understand how long they can operate, and you take the same philosophy as they did with the liquidators. The liquidators had, 7 minutes to go up, remove 1 brick, throw it over the edge and get back. That was their mission done. They moved off. You then got another liquidator and you went through hundreds of them to get the job done. It's the same approach that's being kind of looked at for robotics. You have these low cost platforms that can do a limited time job. You get them back, you can replace the components, you could send it back in again, or you just have another one and keep going. So there are lessons that can be learned in how humans operate that are being applied to the robotic platforms that are being developed.
Thank you so much, Simon. The suggestion is to move the discussion towards present day lessons or present day parallels with COVID, just on the subjects of invisibility and the war rhetoric and the impact on the populations that is not just out there, that could only take place under the communism regime and its ideological denial, but something that is happening here and now globally and across this political spectrum, with various governments demonstrating their potential for tackling issues. So I wonder if some panelists would like to address that parallel. Michael, starting with you.
Yeah, well, I thought when I was sort of thinking about these issues that in terms of this, well, I think one of the things that the show shows really well is the sort of interface between, you know, scientists and scientific knowledge and politicians. And I think it's not just a Soviet or a problem of a certain kind of society, but this problem exists in sort of every society, really, as we are seeing very much today. So one could imagine early kind of Cobra meetings, many of which, of course, Boris Johnson didn't actually attend, but, you know, with Johnson and Cummings and various scientific advisors, and the sort of effort to kind of deny the actual, you know, a sort of an invisible but, you know, inevitable kind of scientifically, you know, a reality that scientists were aware of, and that politicians had a great deal of difficulty in adapting to, along a spectrum from, you know, very, very good responses in some countries to rather belated responses, and in some cases to a complete sort of denial, which we can sort of see, you know, still continuing in the case of certain, you know, world leaders in places like the US and Brazil, and so forth. So I think that's one area where I think that there are strong parallels, and that it's very kind of relevant to, I think what the series has to show is very kind of relevant and relevant beyond its, you know, beyond its immediate context to exactly what's taking place in the present.
Anyone else? Tatiana. Egle, after Tatiana.
So when I was thinking about what in the current situation reminds me about Chernobyl, my first thought was that what the discourse about the disaster in terms of battle, in terms of war, really reminded me the Soviet newspapers on the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. It was all about fighting the invisible enemy and this monster that got out of the control. And I always thought that this cult of the victory in the Second World War was typically Soviet thing. So I was very surprised to see how present this war metaphor is in today's media. And I think just like in Chernobyl, this analogy is not helpful, I think. And we have to think of better metaphor to describe it, because it does sort of hides the real responsibilities for the crisis. And also we cannot present our health workers as soldiers that have to be that can be sacrificed. And also this war rhetoric sort of implies that citizens have to mobilize and be obedient rather than trying to really understand and be aware of the situation. So I think that's an important parallel. I think all these reasons for which we criticize Soviet media for portraying the disaster as war, I think they might apply to the current situation as well.
Thank you. That parallel actually was grasped in a recent article in The Guardian by Serhiy Plokhy on the sense of déjà vu that some of us have experienced vis-a-vis invisibility, silence, miscomprehension, and envisaging something that we've never experienced before, which certainly creates some parallels. Egle, over to you and then to Paul.
Thank you, Ilona. So first and foremost, when I was watching the miniseries, I was surprised. I thought that it would be an interesting story of a Soviet society, and obviously just seeing Chernobyl disaster, kind of seeing what can't be seen, the explosion itself, it was very exciting. I was really waiting to, when will this explosion be shown? And it was shown in the end, which was like this fantastic moment. But what really struck me was that this film was making such a strong point about how decisions are made and how reality subverts decisions the very moment they are made. And when I was rewatching the series for the third time, and it wasn't getting boring, and I just couldn't understand why. And when I was trying to switch on my semiotical analytical mind, and I was thinking, so what are you doing there? Why is it so interesting to watch? And well, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but it appeared that the whole film and scenes are structured that here is a decision or here is an assessment of situation. And then camera goes directly to action and shows that actually something else is happening. And then the key protagonists, they have to readjust and to make new decisions. So I really hope that all public policy and management students will watch and analyze this film, because it shows very realistically what decision makers have to deal in fast evolving situations. And it also shows, I think, quite realistically about how science happens, science in action in Bruno Latour's terms, where reality is evolving and data is changing. And scientists are very good managing this kind of evolving basis of knowledge. And they're very good in tolerating uncertainty. That's the exciting part of the whole thing, but not policymakers. Policymakers want to know what has happened and what to do next. And it's very difficult to bridge the scientific assessment of situation of unknown and evolving reality and policy decision. And I think this is what we've been seeing a lot during COVID crisis. And I remember in 2008, when financial crisis happened, what happened, the outcome of that was that people's financial literacy has increased. Suddenly having a credit card debt, which in the UK is a norm. If you don't have it, a massive credit card debt, you are weird. In Sweden, if you have a credit card full stop at all, then you are a little bit strange. So, so financial literacy raised. So I think that through Chernobyl and through COVID pandemic, hopefully public understanding of what it means to do science of this fast changing, fleeting phenomena is going to be augmented. Sorry, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Over to Paul. Unless there are some urgent commentary from Johan, how did you do that?
I have no urgent commentary on that. I think there is no, I mean, there is, like with all these things, there is it's a difference between analysis and instincts and all of that, you know, and you know, putting a film together, starting from the script and shooting, editing, sound design and all of that, it's a constant process with little movements and small justification, just small adjustments, sorry, along the way, purely instinct driven, you know, there is no pragmatic analytical thought really. It's what you feel works along the way, you know. And the only assessment I have is myself. Do I like it? Do I feel it? Does this mean something to me? And that's what you refer back to, you know. There's no manual, there's nothing to follow more than your own instincts, you know. So I mean, the interesting thing is when we were making Chernobyl, you know, my feeling was like, this is interesting, this can be good, nobody's going to watch it. And everybody shared that sentiment. Craig, everybody involved, like, nobody's going to watch this. Who the hell wants to see, you know, you know, a depressing disaster like this and all the plights of the people and the suffering and all that? Nobody's going to want to watch that. But we were all in agreement that it was an important story to tell, and it was a very important sort of to do the victims and the heroes, which is really what I think it's about. It is about heroism. People talk about us being anti-Sovietic. That's a blanket expression. We're definitely not anti-Sovietic to any extent, but we are definitely you know, opposed to certain structural aspects of how a government work in a catastrophic situation, and that's what we're depicting here. But on the other side, you know, the amount of feelings we have towards the people who were there, the 700,000 liquidators who were there, you know, potentially sacrificing themselves for the greater good of this catastrophe. And with me speaking to a liquidator, you know, 30 years later, very proud of what he had been through and what he had done. He had been ill and he had suffered consequences from it, but very, very proud, and speaking about how he found purpose in his life during this accident, real significant purpose, and me feeling and understanding that and relating to that. You know, I'm just a futile filmmaker. I'm you know, frolicking around making movies. You know, I don't do anything that has that type of purpose. And I was in awe of those sentiments coming from these people, you know. So, you know, all of that together, and it's a long journey, and it's very, very hard work, tremendously hard work. I mean, shooting a limited series like this is literally shooting 3 movies on top of each other, because that's what you're doing, you know. So, but everything is happening with instinct, but with a lot of love and emotions for what's going on. I have no idea what I'm talking about anymore. I feel like veered off, so maybe I should just shut up. Thank you.
Thank you. Guys, with 14 minutes to go, we are going to call right now then to Peter to kind of wrap up cultural significance of the event. And then we have to give justice to the questions on politicization international governance, international audit, and all of them in Q&A. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. I had noticed there's a listserv of people who study nuclear issues that began talking about the ways in which the response to COVID and other disasters like Chernobyl catastrophe, and teaching my course on nuclear visions, I gave a lecture on this where I tried to argue that there are tremendous similarities that we can see, not just the invisibility of the agents of human frailty like the radiation and the viruses, but the invisibility of humans, especially poor and children and minority individuals who are more likely to suffer and be displaced in a disaster. And the ways that catastrophes are political failures with often inadequate political responses, failure to be prepared, efforts to reframe the story to serve the powerful, admonishments to get back to work, the quick turn to blame other people for whatever happened. And then among the public, apocalyptic visions rapidly arise, radiophobia or conspiracy theories, interruption of safe and regular food supplies in both pandemics and nuclear disasters, destruction of habitat also, which seems to be a major cause of the pandemic. So it's sad how timely the film has been to also to help us see these things as well.
Thank you. Over to you, Peter.
Well, as you know, I'm not an expert in any way on any of the specifics of the disaster or this context, but in terms of the question of broader cultural significance, there was a question earlier on from actually one of my colleagues at UCL, William Blacker, who wrote, "What do speakers think about the broader cultural significance of Chernobyl? In Ukraine, it's seen as the dawn of postmodernism and postcolonialism, a sense of the failure of Soviet modernity." And he continues, there were some specifics about Ukrainian literature, which I'm not able, unfortunately, to comment on. But I am interested in this idea of our impulse in the face of something this overwhelming to think of it as a historical landmark. And I think, you know, there are a lot of questions one could ask about that. You know, do we inevitably, as it were, project, perhaps retroactively after the fact, some sort of epochal shift, the idea of, you know, a shift into postmodernism? Do we connect that then with actual tangible political changes? I believe Gorbachev said something, I can't remember the exact quote, but to the extent that Chernobyl was, you know, one of the kind of fundamental events in the leading to the breakup of the Soviet Union. In that sense, I think a parallel we could draw with another event would not so much be COVID, but 9/11. And 9/11 as something that, you know, many people, including myself, often are tempted to see as the end of postmodernism. So for 20 years, we've been in some kind of postmodernism. And obviously, these events all introduce very specific changes. 9/11, of course, introduced, you know, aspects of surveillance state in the United States and certain shifts in foreign policy and things like that. But of course, 9/11 happened and Chernobyl happened because of things that were already in place. So, you know, I'm not going to pretend to have any kind of solid answer as to a kind of chicken and the egg, what causes what. But I think it is interesting to think about the way that disasters on this scale, which seem to burst any kind of framework of understanding we might have, force us to try and supply some kind of meaningfulness to them. And that's something just to think about. So that's all I have to say on that.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Given that we only have 9 minutes remaining now, can I suggest that we do a snake where I will ask a question, and if you want to say something, you do it so quickly and then pass it over to the next person on your screen. And if you don't want to say anything, just say pass. And the questions are really, what are the open secrets of Chernobyl for you? Or alternatively, what is Chernobyl the case of? So I'm going to start with in the order of speaking now. So Egle, could you please say something and pass to the next speaker, who would be Justa?
Wow, I didn't count on being the first. Right. In what sense Chernobyl is or what is the open secret? So I would like to think about Chernobyl and Chernobyl's nature debate. And this kind of open secret and this kind of Chernobyl is used often to illustrate the hope that humanity, that we have as part of Western culture, that nature somehow rebuilds itself and it returns to its pristine condition. I don't know if this is a Christian myth or something, but there's hope to return to purity. And Chernobyl is all often framed like that. So I think an open secret is that when humans damage the biosphere particularly badly, the biosphere probably doesn't go to its prior condition. It mutes, it transforms into something else. And this is an open secret.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but that was my telephone timer telling me we have to move on to get to the tail of the snake.
Yes.
So just one idea.
So that's I finished.
Thank you. Justa, over to you.
Okay. I didn't even know I'm a speaker, but okay. I just, the case of Chernobyl reminds me and this Anthropocene aspect of the damage to the biosphere that Egle just mentioned, a very simple example given by Lithuanian artist Julijonas Urbonas to me, when he says that all technology is dangerous. Even a pen or a chair is a dangerous tool, and you can imagine how many hazardous environments these small, very small technologies have envisioned. So of course, very, very, very complex technologies such as nuclear technologies, their impact, it's insurmountable. So just learning to understand that any technology, including probably our Zoom, probably has its own hazards, and we need to apprehend them in advance.
Thank you very much. Simon Evans, followed by Simon Watson. Any short punchlines or takeaways from the panel today?
On the question of what's the open secret of Chernobyl, I think maybe I would rephrase it, what's the obvious unaddressed question that we have from Chernobyl? And I think there are two of them. One of them is, what is the impact of Chernobyl? And anybody who tells you that they know categorically what the impact of Chernobyl, what the numbers of deaths were, what the environmental impact was, is either an idiot or very, very brave. So I would encourage you to be very, very cautious when people talk about, I know what the impact of Chernobyl was, because it's immensely complicated. The second open secret of Chernobyl is that what we have seen now is really Chernobyl, for the first time since the accident, can start addressing the long-term consequences. It is an immensely challenging decommissioning process. So people think about closure of Chernobyl, particularly in relation to the confinement. I wouldn't think about closure. I would think of a new stage, and it's very important that it's not forgotten, because that new stage is crucial to be able to carry on for many decades to come.
Thank you. The International Nuclear Energy Agency has got frequently asked questions about Chernobyl site. I really recommend our audience to check it out for brave answers. Thank you, Simon, and over to Simon Watson now.
So I just take the comments that have come up about whether the lack of communication, the totalitarian nature of the government, whether that impinged and hindered on the disaster recovery, and actually flip that and say the disaster actually opened up communications. There was a realization that nuclear accidents are not a national issue. They are a global issue. They don't affect one country, they affect many countries. And that actually opened up the international nuclear safety engagement across the world. It strengthened the International Atomic Energy Agency to a point where the world is much safer now because of Chernobyl, because people are talking to each other about the safety requirements and lessons that are being learned, and they're sharing that information rather than keeping it to themselves. So I think there's the open secret is it's actually been beneficial for the world and for society.
Thank you. Tatiana?
For me, the open secret about Chernobyl disaster is what my colleagues in social science and in history called the production of ignorance about Chernobyl health effects. It's really very, very complex to produce scientific data and make those medical effects visible. It requires collection of vast amounts of data, and continuously it requires the deployment of all the infrastructure for collection and analysis of this data. And these efforts were not made, the efforts were made not to collect this data or ignore the data that was available. And I think if there was a question whether the series attracts attention to scholarship or overshadow it, I think they do. And I would highly recommend to read two books on the production of ignorance, Olga Skuchinskaya books on politics on visibility, and Kay Brown's Manual for Survival.
Thank you. Vitaly, over to you.
Yes, so for me, the secret of Chernobyl will always be this invisibility of the danger. And I remember visiting an official museum of Chernobyl in Kiev with audio guide, where at the very beginning of this exposition, the visitor hears the story that Chernobyl was inscribed in the prophet in the Bible. So it's pretty much shows how we deal with invisible things, and that perhaps there will be many myths to come in the future, and many attempts to talk about it and to try to trace it.
Thank you. Paul, Michael, any?
Sure. I just wanted to say that for me, the open secret is that what seems to be a history or a story about the past is actually talking about Chernobyl, the series, rather than Chernobyl, the reality, is like a kind of a myth of the near future in a Balladian kind of sense. So that's my sentence.
Thank you. Paul?
My sense is like Simon Evans, that this is the beginning of the next stage. Nowhere in the world has the nuclear industry managed to store properly spent fuel and dealt with radioactive waste properly. Now, at least after $2.5 billion expenditure, real cleanup at some aspects of the Chernobyl disaster can begin. But this is just the beginning.
Great, thank you very much. We are at 1700 exactly, but Johan,
I want to have a last sentence, and I will quote the series directly, and I think it's a suiting question. This is the open secret, and it's a suiting question for Chernobyl, but it's a suiting question for the pandemic right now, and it's quoted from the series, and it's the simple question: what is the cost of lies? And that, I think, is the ultimate takeaway of the series, and I think that is something that is very pertinent in the situation we're dealing with right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Johan. Thank you very much, all the participants. It was a pleasure hosting this webinar and being part of it. Thank you.
Thanks to all, and
Thank you
thanks
very
to
much.
the audience.
Thanks. Thanks to all the panelists.
And thanks to This Is Tomorrow.
And thanks to the Arts and the Humanities Research Council in the UK, who also supported this event. Stay safe. See you hopefully online and offline very soon.